Jacobo Grinberg, The Conscious Brain. Prologue. The recent discovery of the relationship between brain activity and gravitational force, and the experimental demonstration of the existence of direct communication between human beings correlated with an increase in brain coherence, are part of the body of experimental evidence that, 3 years after completing the manuscript of The Conscious Brain, supports what began as purely hypothetical, that is, the existence of the neuronal field and its conceptualization as a unified field. The desire to understand the creation of experience has guided this and the works that precede it. Here, as in Foundations of Experience, Psychophysiology of Consciousness 1, I postulate that experience is the interaction of the neural field with the energetic structure of space. I christen the latter with the term Sintergy and postulate a similarity between the synergistic organization of space and the organization of the brain. The neural field affects and alters the synergistic organization, and at a certain level of functioning is one with it, such that the product of brain activity merges with the rest of creation. This is what I propose, recognizing that the idea is novel from a psychophysiological point of view, but as old as human history from a religious and philosophical point of view. The concept of the neural field and its expansion and interaction with space is the paradigmatic scientific counterpart to the consciousness of unity. Those who feel connected to the whole in its multiple manifestations know that their body contains them in such a way that in their perception of the world, the internal and the external do not exist as two independent but interconnected realms, nor do the observer and the observed exist as two separate and dichotomized realities. Rather, there is one reality, and it does not admit of separations. The organic body is a model of the universal body, and therefore, its functioning holds the key to understanding the rest. A cell is immersed within an energetic matrix that nourishes it, and of which it is an indissoluble part. Nothing is random for a cell seen from the perspective of the bodily integrity and its apex, consciousness. The same is true of the latter, which, seen from the perspective of the universal body, constitutes a cell indissolubly linked to other consciousnesses, forming a colossally organized whole. However, from the perspective of the individual cell or embodied consciousness, the world appears external, chaotic, and fundamentally disconnected from an organic unity rarely expanded beyond the membranous border of the cell wall covering or human skin. This is not an absence of true unity, but merely an error of perspective that is fully corrected when the first signs indicative of an absence of randomness appear. This is why it is so important to understand the matrix of the whole as an organ of the body itself, and to feel consciousness and experience as manifestations of the whole in an infinite and timeless present. Consciousness, like perception, is founded on and sustained by the existence of patterns. However, life is not lived by knowledge of the patterns themselves or by access to all the laws of interaction, although powerfully significant and interesting, but rather by relying on this knowledge in order to transcend it and thus achieve the loss of the illusion of separation. Beyond unity lies being, which cannot be explained on the basis of the whole, even when one abandons the attempt to consider it as emergent and falls into the knowledge of a world beyond this world, into an ineffable Tao, because the real question is the existence of any existence, considering experience, any experience, as synonymous with existence. The question of why we feel cannot be answered with reductionism or bodily expansions. Certainly in any experience is the whole, but from the miraculous state of wonder at the occurrence of feeling, It is known that there is no plausible and satisfactory explanation for the experience. Such a state could well be called purity, or, if you prefer, enchantment. Any name is insufficient to convey the miracle of experiencing from an empty balcony, to take advantage of Yomi Garcia Ascot's fortunate phrase here. But beyond that, the formulation of the question holds an even deeper mystery, because only that which manages to transcend feeling is the only one capable of glimpsing its existence. Thus, the question about the origin of experiencing always shifts to the question about the identity of the one who posits the existence of the manifestation, that is, to the observer. Who is the observer? When cerebral coherence increases, the gravitational force is altered according to our latest experimental results. Direct communication is also achieved when coherence increases, since these increases are equivalent to, or at least bring, brain activity closer to the very organization of space. It is conceivable that there is fundamentally a single observer. If this is correct, the sense of individuality is as false as that of separation, and thus being, consciousness, experience, and the Tao are one and the same reality. I recognize the difficulty of reconciling this vision of the world and reality with feelings of individuality and separation, especially when the perceptual vision of the world contains, as ever-present elements, the existence of objects external to our bodies and beings, moving into a space that seems not to belong to us as part of our corporeal envelope. No theoretical analysis is capable of altering our perceptual phenomenology, even though through such analysis we might conclude that our percepts are a level of final resultant of a process that is itself distinct from that of its resultant. In other words, we transform an undifferentiated energy matrix into neuronal activity, and then transform this again into experience, such that the latter does not constitute, in its relative aspect, the essence of reality, but rather one of its possible transformations. In this way, the vision of external objects is in reality the perception of neuronal patterns that in themselves do not differ dimensionally from the same space that we experience as alien to our own identity. Thus, the reality we consider essential is illusory outside of the level of final resultant necessary to create it. The same could be said of any content of experience, except experiencing itself. This last point deserves clarification, since it is the foundation of this entire work. Regardless of the content and level of experience, regardless of the illusory nature of relative manifestations, there is something that cannot be considered accessory, and that is the phenomenon of experience itself, whatever its content, modality, or character. Even the vision of myself as a separate observer of a reality projected onto me is itself another experience. So the experience of feeling separate and the experience of the projection itself are unified in that both are experiences. Therefore, it seems to me that solving the mystery of the creation of experience is the first step on the path to true knowledge. This has been my motivation in writing this book. Before concluding this prologue, I would like to clarify 2 points. The first concerns the consideration of unification as resulting from the activation of inclusive or convergent logic. In reality, the activation of convergent circuits is neither the only nor the principal operation that leads to unification. More powerful than it is the unification resulting from dimensional changes. A good example in this regard is the neuronal field. In its dimension, the dispersed neuronal activation is unified when it is incorporated in its entirety into a new dimension that contains it. Something similar happens in the formation of chemical compounds resulting from the combination of elements that are contained and unified in the new chemical dimension. Water unifies the dispersed hydrogen and oxygen atoms into a new unit dimensionally different from the elements that comprise it. The second clarificación is to justify the inclusión of the experimental work presented in the first appendixes de este work. In realidad, the presentación is due in part to the importancia de the results and the elegance of the methodology used, but above all to the fact that immunological work is a good example of the interaction between two fields, the antigenic and the antibody fields. Therefore, it could be used as a simplified model of the interaction of the neuronal field with the synergistic field, one from space. I begin this work with an analysis of space. The reasons that compel me to do so are compelling. First, because everything that exists is space at different levels or degrees of organization. Space is the basis and foundation of everything, and at the same time, it is one. Second, because a deep understanding of the characteristics of space, time, and matter will allow us to comprehend their essence. It would be enough to offer the appropriate conceptual foundations to allow a correct understanding of what we call time to justify dedicating the first and most important chapter of this work to space. According to Gustavo Fernandez, understanding and sensing time is possessing wisdom. Since space lies behind the understanding of time, I could add that understanding space is possessing the key to wisdom. There have been many attempts to unravel the mystery of space. Kant, for example, considered space to be a priori and given. For him, both time and space were the genetically established foundations upon which the phenomenological world was constructed. Kant's concept of space was impressively abstract in its purity. An argument such as that by removing or destroying every material object, every organic entity, everything given to us by perception or thought, space would remain, allowed Kant to consider space as the indestructible foundation of reality. Other thinkers have gone further in their understanding of space. Ouspensky, for example, spoke of spaces of different dimensions. He mentioned the existence of spaces within other spaces like fish in a pond. Memorable are his famous analyses of universes of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 dimensions, and his idea that these universes are thus perceived by entities that develop by becoming aware of the existence of the same dimensions. Ouspensky's analysis indicates that space itself is multidimensional, and that it manifests itself differently for those who possess the ability to see it in its different dimensions. Thus, we, three-dimensional beings, are capable of perceiving and conceiving space as having 3 dimensions. A 4-dimensional entity would include our space in a section of its universe, perceiving time as a spatial dimension. In this way, a 4-dimensional universe would include the past, present, and future in a spatial whole. We will see in other chapters how an expansion of the duration of the present would make us 4-dimensional beings. Ouspensky's vision came from Hinton, Dunn, and Gurdjieff. An example that helps understand this entire conception of space would be conceiving a 2-dimensional being seen from a 3-dimensional perspective. This hypothetical being, although Ouspensky does not consider it as such, since he identifies certain beings as entities with 2-dimensional perception, would live on a plane and perceive lines and surfaces, but not volumes. Living on a plane, it would not realize that everything it transects belongs to a more unified universe. If a hand were placed on its phenomenological plane, it would see 5 independent circles, and would never imagine that these connect in the 3-dimensional universe to form a hand. Thus, we do not see the uniqueness of the 4-dimensional world, and are therefore unable to perceive the common origin of entities that we phenomenologically view as independent. Our present is a section of a 4-dimensional space, just as the plane on which our fingers rest is a section of a 3-dimensional space. In the thought of Ouspensky and his school, the intimate relationship between time and space is clear. A transformation of time into a spatial dimension is the secret to dimensional change. The Viper, a two-dimensional being for Ouspensky, is incapable of perceiving volumes. It interprets as time what in another dimension would be three-dimensional. If a cube is presented to it in motion, this animal will see a series of planes in complex changes of location, but will be unable to unify these planes into a volumetric whole. Similarly, our vision of a human being or a tree contains implicitly, but not explicitly, the perception of its becoming. This is the limitation of our three-dimensional destiny. As four-dimensional entities, we would be able to have a vision of the tree in its history, from the seed to its disintegration, as a four-dimensional solid body. The world would not be three-dimensional sections of the four-dimensional, but the latter, and all by the transformation of time into space. There was a time when man perceived space in two dimensions. The discovery of three-dimensionality, or at least its schematization, was made by Leonardo da Vinci when he discovered the laws of perspective. Interestingly, not far removed from this development, another with similar repercussions arose with Newton's discovery of gravity. All of us, before and after Newton, remained glued to the earth, but no one before Newton had realized this. The relationship between space, time, and gravity will become clearer as this work progresses. For now, one can only marvel that, as a conceptual discovery, the three-dimensional world and the existence of gravitational force were not far apart in time. Space is, therefore, that which is given and indestructible, that which is multidimensional manifested as a restricted section, that which is mysteriously associated with time, or that which is perceived as transparent nullity. But is this really the case? Do you consider feasible an analysis of space that differs from the Kantian conception and that goes beyond the Newtonian and Ouspensky's vision? Such an analysis was made, in part, by Einstein when he considered space as curved, analyzing it as a concrete entity that changes its fundamental characteristics according to gravitational or temporal influences. Space, as curved in the vicinity of a gravitational field, is space seen from another, extra or supraspatial dimension. It is no longer space as an a priori category in the Kantian manner, or multi-dimensional space as Ouspensky saw it. It is space as an organized entity. At least, this is the reference point that will be used here. Space as an organized energy network, and space as the basis and foundation of organized perception. But enough of the preamble. Let's begin our analysis by taking human perception as our starting point and reference. Let's start with ourselves and see what we can offer. Space is transparency. It is what, as a container, includes, in its different portions, material objects that, in our perception, are in different locations. A ball is solid, located in space and differentiated from it by its concrete character. The curious, extraordinarily curious thing about this example, or any other that attempts to describe the difference between transparency and opacity, between the solid and the intangible, is that the content of all material things is precisely that space that we consider different, fundamentally and essentially, from matter. Space contains matter at every point. The proof of this is our ability to see. We see space, and that space is what contains matter. When we approach an object and perceive how it increases in size, what we do is continue to see space, but now with more of the object's content. Let's analyze this with an example. I look out the window. Outside there is a tree, and I distinguish it from the space that contains it. The difference is that space is nothing, and the tree is something. But what do I really see? I see the space that contains the tree. My retina is incapable of touching the bark, the leaves, and the trunk of the tree. My retina sees space, which is where the information about the tree is found. It is a small space, barely the size of the area of my retina, that transforms space into nerve signals. Therefore, space is only transparent in my construction of the place that separates me from the object. In other words, I normally see the area of space that my retina transects. This area contains the information that makes me perceive space as transparent, the information about the distance separating me from the tree and the tree itself. It's a repeating, redundant area, and I can only transform what truly comes into contact with me. Let's see this with another example. I'm sitting in a garden, and a mosquito flies near me. The point in space I'm transecting changes due to the mosquito's flight, and therefore I'm able to see this insect. If I move, I still see the mosquito's flight. If I move again, and do it 1,000,000 times, I'll still see the mosquito's flight. What does this mean? It means that each point in space is connected to one another, and that a change in one of its portions affects the whole of it. The mosquito is in space and is space. The fish in the water is a clear image in this sense. Water is space, and that space moves with the fish's swimming. Any sufficiently sensitive instrument placed near the fish would detect vibrations, ripples, pressure changes, and currents in the water. The space that is transparent to the fish is, for the instrument, a quasi-solid network interconnected in all its parts. If what we see is space, and each of its points contains objects, we should be able to answer the question of how it contains them. Physics has already taken care of that, and one of its chapters, optical holography, contains the answer. The basis of holographic technology is the fact that visual information about an object is contained in the magnitude and phase relationships of the electromagnetic waves reflected by the object. This is only partially true, since light is not only electromagnetic waves, but also photon waves. However, for our purposes, it is sufficient to consider the magnitude and phase differences of the light reflected by an object as fundamental to perceptual dynamics. I was saying then, that information about a three-dimensional, illuminated object is contained in the magnitude and phase relationships of the waves. Every point in the space surrounding the object contains, among other things, this information. Therefore, from any point in space, it is possible to see the object. But again, what is perceived is space containing this information, or, rather, the extremely complex transformation of this information. This transformation is carried out by the retina and the rest of the visual nervous system. I have already analyzed this transformation in other works: Psychophysiology of Learning, New Principles of Physiological Psychology, Creation of Experience, and the Foundations of Experience, so I won't repeat the details here. Suffice it to say that, over millions of years of evolution, we have developed a series of neural mechanisms that, applying algorithmic logic, decode the information contained at each point in space, and transform it into an energy field, which, interacting with the organization of space, results in the appearance of an image. Returning to space then, this is information organized at each of its points. It is also an interconnected energy network, of which we are able to decode only isolated and restricted portions. Our inability to see all points in space simultaneously is simply a lack of mechanism and a lack of training. Which of the two is more important? I don't know. Some say the mechanism exists, and that all we lack is the proper training to get it working. Whatever the case, the fact is that our perceptual capacity, although extraordinary, only allows us to decode what our retina transects. But even from the portion we transect, we don't obtain or decode all the information it contains. Due to the inability of our receptors to respond to wavelengths and particles outside a relatively restricted range, we don't see radio waves, cosmic rays, infrared, or ultraviolet light. The rest, that is, what is capable of activating our receptors, must be adjusted to a degree of organization such that extending it, or rather, surpassing it, would only result in transparency. Let's see this with an example again. For a tree to be visible, the organization of the spatial information it provides must be adequate for the brain mechanism responsible for decoding it. If the complexity of this organization exceeds a limit, the image is chaotic, or there is no image at all. A person born blind due to cataracts who, after surgery, is able to stimulate their retinal receptors again, perceives absolute chaos. We normally learn to decode organized information, and from there we construct our images. If we apply all these considerations to space and matter, several conclusions would become clear. On the one hand, about the transparency of space and the opacity of objects. We said earlier that we are incapable of simultaneously perceiving and decoding all of space, that what we usually do is manage only the portion that transects our retina, and that this portion is transformed into vision of transparent space and perception of solid objects. The difference between transparency and solidity is nothing more and nothing less than the degree of organization. Transparent space is too complex in its organization to be algorithmized. What we call matter, on the other hand, is less complex and easier to reduce to an algorithm. If the ease or difficulty of algorithmic reduction is a measure of organization, then a material object perceived as solid and a transparent space are seen as such, because in the portion of space that contains information about both, the former material object is represented by an organization that we are capable of handling, and the latter, transparent space, is represented by an organization so complex that we are unable to decode it. In other words, and now in a more general context, matter is an organization of space that the human brain, and that of other animals, are capable of decoding and reducing to a neural algorithm, while what we call transparency and absence of materiality is an organization of space so complex that we are unable to decode it. From here we can affirm, with certainty, that the difference between space and matter is a product of brain activity, since in reality space and matter are part of a continuum that differs in organization and complexity. We see a material object when we come into contact with those areas of the space-matter continuum that we are capable of organizing. We see transparent space when we are unable to discover and decode an energetic organization that exceeds our capacity for organization. I have spoken of algorithmization as a measure of organization, and of decoding as a capacity for algorithmic reduction. What does all this mean? In particular, what is organized space, and with what parameters can its organization be defined and measured? These questions are fundamental, since their adequate answers will determine our understanding of phenomena such as time, space, matter, and what we call gravitation. Chemistry is extraordinarily profound in its algorithmic capacity. Therefore, a simple example taken from that discipline will help us understand the concepts of algorithmization, decoding, and organization. Let us suppose we have before us a sample of water and another of deoxyribonucleic acid. Both are organized compounds, that is, capable of being reduced to an algorithmic formula. For water, this will be the three-dimensional representation of 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen, repeated billions of times. The formula Ho, or its spatial representation, are algorithms that would allow us, by appropriately combining the represented chemical elements, to obtain the original sample. Thus, An algorithm can be defined as a symbolic formula that allows the reconstruction of the original compound. The organization of water is the way in which its constituent elements are related and interact redundantly. Decoding the organization of water consists precisely in its algorithmic representation. Organization, decoding, and algorithm are thus mutually defined. The complexity of an organization is measured by the number of elements that constitute it, their interactions, and the complexity of the algorithm required to represent them. Deoxyribonucleic acid, formed by complex chains of amino acids, is a more complex organization than water, for all the reasons explained above. The number of elements that constitute it, their mutual interactions, and therefore the algorithm necessary to represent it, are much more complex than those of water. Exactly the same situation prevails with respect to space. The brain explores spatial information and transforms its inherent organization into one or a series of algorithms. Material objects are easier to algorithmize than space, therefore the former appear as a concrete image, while the latter is transparent and intangible. The algorithmization operations begin with retinal transduction and end with the activation of convergent circuits, which concentrate, in polysensory structures, neuronal logical codes that represent the organization of the space-matter continuum in cerebral language. Space, in its organization, appears to us as organized, with matter being locations of its content that differ in organization from the rest of it. We could think of a gigantic spiderweb in which, from time to time, thin lines join together, thicken, or simply curve, giving rise to matter. It is this same space that we perceive from one of its points, with the difference that the spiderweb image that point contains provides information about the rest of the network. The Kantian conception of space manifests, implicitly or explicitly, its inflexible character. The consideration of its a priori existence indicates that space is given to us as such, and that no learning process can or could modify it. For the abstract space that Kant conceived, the above is absolutely true. However, from the point of view I am considering, the aplastic characteristic of spatial perception does not exist. In other words, space is transformed into matter and has been transformed within it phylogenetically, and even ontogenetically speaking. We learn to detect specific spatial organizations, and in this learning lies perceptual evolution. Humans who lived on this planet millions of years ago probably viewed some of the things we have learned to perceive as material objects as transparent space. And vice versa, at some stages of human development, humans probably viewed as material objects what we currently view as transparent space. In the Middle Ages, for example, the perception of gnomes, spirits, and ethereal apparitions was common knowledge and shared experience. In some Amazonian tribes even today, Native Americans are able to perceptually solidify space and use this vision to levitate. Therefore, the perception of space and the vision of material objects are modified through learning. If a material object is organized space, this learning consists of the ability to detect this specific organization. Another example of the ability to perceptually materialize space is oral vision. There are training techniques through which a subject can learn to perceive auras. These are nothing more than spatial organizations that, for most people, remain uncodified and therefore unperceived. In general, these techniques imply certainty about the existence of the phenomena to be perceived, and an increase in decoding sensitivity. Just as it is possible to materialize space, it is also possible to perform the opposite operation, that is, to dematerialize it. Space, viewed as an energetic organization, can be studied, as here, based on perceptual functioning and phenomenology. The characteristics of its organization mentioned so far can be summarized in the following points. 1. The organization of space is variable. 2. This variation manifests itself in extreme cases, such as the appearance of material objects. 3. The organization of space is the way in which information is contained within it. 4. Each point in space, when it varies, affects the other points. 5. The information content at each point in space is relatively redundant. 6. The organization of space can be so complex that no known mechanism is capable of decoding it. 7. The brain is what creates the transparency of space and the materiality of objects. 8. When decoding occurs, matter appears. 9. There is no empty space. This last point deserves an explanation. Suppose an astronaut is floating in space, hundreds of light years away from any star. Let's also suppose that the most detailed and refined analyses fail to demonstrate that any chemical compound, or even any elementary particle, exists at that point in space. From a chemical and even physical perspective, that space could be considered empty. However, the astronaut is able to see stars from his position. The portion of space transected by his retina is organized and filled with information. Therefore, it is not an empty space. Another point deserves clarification. The solidification and materialization of space have different degrees or perceptual levels. These range from the nebulous vision of a lake evaporating to the metalloid appearance of a lead sphere. As we mentioned before, the ability to detect the organization of space and therefore to transform its transparency into percepts can be trained. Learning to paint is one technique, another is focusing attention on complex objects. A rock or a cloud, viewed in a concentrated manner and for an extended period, becomes a vision of faces, animals, sculptural forms, and even sequences of increasingly complex, meaningful images. In these, the nervous system learns to organize a series of disconnected elements into a meaningful perceptual whole. Tribes that use hallucinogens can frequently achieve a degree of mastery in their ability to perceive spatial organizations. All these techniques have in common an increase in the capacity to algorithmize perceptual elements, to simultaneously perceive a set of portions of space, and to include several perceptual elements within a broader and more inclusive whole. If every point in space contains information about all the other points, and we are unable to see more than one point, what would happen if our vision were to see all points simultaneously? Surely, space would change before our eyes. We could see everything like an external observer sees a pool of water in which a fish swims. Our vision would be so productive that by harnessing it, we could fly, like the perceptual capacity of some Amazonian Indian tribes or the Tibetans. The latter are capable of solidifying perceptual space and transforming thought into material realities. But this should not surprise us, since the material objects we see are, in reality, the product of our thinking. Returning to space, the simultaneous vision of its organizing points would grant us an extraordinary capacity in our human lives. It would be possible, with this vision, to see the direct influences of one spatial event on another. We currently do this, but in a very restricted way. We do so with only a limited portion of space. A clear image in this sense is that of a bird flying. As we saw before, if an animal is 100 meters away from us and we can see its flight, it means that this flight affects the space we transect, modifies the organization of the point in space that touches our retina, and this modification carries within it the coded representation of the bird's flight. Therefore, we are capable of perceiving the effect of one portion of space on another, and therefore, of perceiving the connection between the two. But the bird's flight modifies not only the portion of space we see, but all of space. If we conceptualize the bird as a moving mathematical point, everything around that point changes in its organization due to this movement. In reality, it's as if spheres of change expanded from that point in space, affecting space in all its dimensions. If we were able to simultaneously see all points in space in the same way we see one, what would appear to us would be these expanding spheres, altering everything. Again, the image of water is appropriate. A stone falling into the center of a pond forms circular ripples that expand in all directions. When the stone is submerged in the liquid, each and every area of the latter is altered by the stone's movement. The same thing happens in space, but we are unable to see it, and we are unable to do so because the organization of transparent space is so complex that it defies our decoding processes. In reality, seeing a material object is possible for the simple reason that it is an alteration in the organization of space at several points simultaneously. It is as if a large space diminished the synergy in its organization or became so simplified that our cerebral mechanisms could decode it. The vision of a materialized space is precisely the simultaneous vision of several synergistically organized portions. See chapters 8 and 9. The possibility of detecting this synergy in transparent space would allow us to perceive what that space hides behind its transparency. I want to emphasize that the materialization of space is not an esoteric event, but rather, on the contrary, constitutes the normal everyday way of seeing objects. Only an extension of this normal capacity would allow us to perceive what in other ages, levels and cultures was normal perception. That is, the extension of perceptual materialization into transparent space. So far, we've discussed the space given by visual perception, and have developed certain concepts based on the abstraction of this visual processing. But, obviously, space is not only the organization of light. I already mentioned this when discussing the restriction on the sensitivity of our retinal receptors, but is also organized by traveling chemical particles, odors and wind, at least atmospheric space. Similar, though more restricted, insights apply to the study of the organization of olfactory space, or to that of elementary particles and radio waves. Given the incredibly large amount of information that each point or portion of space contains, it is predictable that adequate training in decoding and analyzing this information would increase by several orders of magnitude man's cognitive and perceptual capacity. The brain is organized by complex neural circuits that have reached their current development after millions of years of evolution. Everything in the brain is designed to decode and analyze space in the way we do today. It is possible to consider brain organization as a kind of logical materialization of space. At least, this consideration is appropriate if we take into account the way the brain has evolved. An example is the retina. Its size and logical functions have been determined to a greater or lesser extent by the way space is organized. The portion of space capable of activating retinal circuits is not random in its dimensions. It would be enough for the retina to be double or triple its current size for the perception of the world to be significantly altered. Such increases in retinal dimensions would probably cause double or triple vision of objects. This would necessarily be the case if the rest of the visual system did not algorithmically concentrate visual information. Even the current size of the retina should, at least theoretically, produce hyperduplicated views of objects, because the minimum size of the space sufficient to contain the information we handle is many times smaller than the retinal size. In fact, the retinal output carries redundant information from the universe. This information is not perceived as redundant, as I mentioned before, because in the central portions of the nervous system, inclusion operations manage the redundancy until it is no longer perceived as such. Evidence for the redundancy of optical information is the fact that a lesion of 98.5% of the optic nerve fibers is not sufficient to affect complex perceptual discrimination in the cat, Norton T., Frommer G., and Galambos R. 1966. Fedien, Proc. Fedien, AM, SOCs, EXP, Biol, 5 2100 and 68.25, 263. Now and later I will analyze how information redundancy is handled neuronally to give rise to a unified experience. Suffice it to say here that one of the outstanding characteristics of the brain's handling of information is the so-called convergence inclusion operations. In these, dispersed signals transmitted through many neural channels are concentrated into convergent units, such that logical neural codes develop in the latter that contain, in a concentrated form, what before their activation was dispersed and redundant information. This inclusive management is a cerebral extension of natural inclusive operations. These have accompanied the evolution of complex systems as a constant and ever-active force or energy. This same force formed the first inclusive unit, the atom, from the organization of a set of elementary particles. Later, it contributed to organizing several atoms into a new inclusive unit, the molecule. From here, complex compounds emerged as new inclusive units. The cell represents a grandiose and emergent stage in this same process. Made up of millions of cleverly organized elements, the cell, as an inclusive, gestalt, and hyper-complex unit, carries within it a property not contained in its constituent elements, what we call life. The same inclusive process caused a complex cellular organization to give rise to a new inclusive unit, the tissue. From there, in ascending order, the organ, and finally, the entire organism. Each level of inclusion represents the emergence of new properties not contained within the partitions that comprise it. Consciousness as an emergent property would be the pinnacle of an entire inclusive organization. Interestingly, space displays a similar inclusive organization, albeit based on different operations. When I mentioned that a point or portion of space contains, in a complex and hyper-concentrated informational organization, gigantic amounts of information, I was thinking of this cerebral and natural inclusive ordering, transferring it to spatial organization. Therefore, the brain can be considered a logical embodiment of the organization of space. It is interesting to speculate about one of the outcomes of the spatial and cerebral similarities and their transformations. A natural pattern involving a sequence of ordered events is reproduced at different levels in cellular activity and in the conscious processing of information. Something like a space-cell-brain continuum appears as a result of dimensional transformations of logical contents. This was already known by the writers of the I Ching, who found a spectacular similarity between what happens in nature and what occurs in consciousness. The postulation that everything is interconnected within a mutually stimulating energetic network could explain such similarities. We will see later that the postulation of an expanding neuronal energy field in space could explain the interrelationships between brain activity and spatial organization. For now, it is sufficient to state that, at a fundamental level, everything is based on the same thing and everything is the same energy patterns at different degrees or levels of organization. Space, above all, is constituted by organized energy patterns. Of course, one must ask where these patterns are found, what sustains and contains them, and how they are nourished, The last question is relatively easy to answer. Humankind, the plant world, a star, an emitter of electromagnetic waves, and in general, any material body, nourish space in their very organization. In fact, virtually this entire chapter has dealt with space in its energetic content. The question of what contains all these patterns is more difficult to answer. In fact, all attempts to define, or even describe, the container have proved fruitless. Even the hypothesis about the existence of ether as the basic substance of space has been called into question by the invariance of the speed of light. It was believed that ether was dragged by the Earth, and therefore that the Earth's relative speed would affect the speed of light, measured with or against the Earth's motion. The fact that no difference was found in these measurements cast doubt on the possibility of ether being pulled by the Earth, or even ether itself. The container is Kantian space, the a priori and fundamental. Its reality is more cognitive than physical, more conceptual than concrete. In itself, it is space, energetic organization, container, and content simultaneously. Returning to the organization of space, an excellent instrument for visualizing it from an objective perspective is a camera, preferably an older model whose aperture can be varied over a wide range. Suppose we place our camera with an aperture diameter of 1 mm in front of a landscape, take a photograph, and, pointing in the same direction, move the camera a millimeter and a fraction thereof. The new view will be of the portion of space 1 millimeter in diameter, separated by a fraction of a millimeter from the point in space 1 millimeter in diameter in the first photograph. Even though the two photographs come from two independent points in space, which are also separated by a fraction of a millimeter from another portion of space, they will result in two practically identical images. This is a demonstration of the redundancy of the organization of space. Like the eye, the camera records the information that passes through the opening of its diaphragm. In other words, it records the organization of the space limited by the diaphragm. The information contained in that space is quantum, in the sense that there is a lower limit, below which the image of a landscape ceases to be one. In other words, it is possible to ask the following question: what is the minimum portion of space capable of containing enough information to give rise to a specific image? Or, if you prefer, what is the minimum spatial dimension capable of containing the entire spatial algorithm of an object or a landscape? There must exist a minimum, which I will call the quantum of space. The closer we get to a given quantum of space, the less information redundancy there will be. If the diaphragm diameter exceeds a given quantum of space by many orders of magnitude, the algorithm needed to reconstruct the specific image associated with that quantum will be more redundant. Perhaps this explains the increase in depth of field associated with a decrease in diaphragm diameter. Although I'll cover this topic in more detail later, it's necessary to clarify the concept of synergy from here. The term synergy comes from the words synthesis and energy, and refers to the organization of information in any space where some degree of convergence is manifested. If a point in a space contains concentrated information about the rest of the space, that space possesses a synergistic organization. The portions of a Sintergic space in which each of its points, or quanta, contains a greater concentration of information are the portions of that space with the greatest synergy. An example in this sense is a portion of intergalactic space far from any star. At this extreme of high synergy, a point of infinitesimal dimensions will contain enormous information about the rest of the universe. If we start from this space and approach a star, what we will observe is that the points in space close to the star contain less information. This would be a portion of space with lower synergy. The extreme of lower synergy would be the star in the example or any other material object. One of the characteristics of a high synergy space, in addition to the high concentration of information in each of its quanta, is its high redundancy. A good example in this sense is the apparent immobility of objects very far from an observer, despite the latter's motion. The view of the moon from a moving car is characteristic, and its apparent immobility is explained by the high redundancy of the quanta the observer transects. In contrast, in a low synergy space, redundancy is minimal. There are other characteristics of synergy that will be analyzed later and in Volume 3 of this series, Space and Consciousness. The Psychophysiology of Consciousness 3. Suffice it to say here that what we call gravitational force and time are alterations in Sintergic organization. An increase in gravitational force is nothing more than a reduction in informational redundancy and a decrease in informational concentration in each quantum of a space. A decrease in gravitational force is due to an increase in redundancy and an increase in informational concentration at each point in space. Time, in turn, passes more slowly in a high redundancy space, high synergy, and more quickly in a low synergy space. 2 of time and space. Any change in the organization of space manifests as time. Time, then, is an alteration in the organization of space. In an experiment considered classic, 2 physicists measured with synchronized atomic clocks the passage of time near and far from the Earth's gravitational field. They found that time passes more slowly in relative distance from the planet's surface than in proximity to it. Since there is a space-matter continuum, at the interface of that continuum there is a change in the organization of space and, therefore, time passes more or less quickly in different portions of the space-matter organization. In the previous chapter, I mentioned the existence of a quantum of space, and I defined it as the smallest portion of it capable of containing information. I said that the quantum of space changes dimensions depending on the amount of information algorithmically represented within it. If we apply the same criterion to the information reduced within the quantum, we find that there are quanta of different degrees of extension, forming an infinite continuum. In other words, if a table can be seen through a 1 mm diameter hole placed 1 meter away from it, the quantum of space for the table will be that millimeter placed at that distance. If the millimeter were placed closer to the table, it would not encompass the entire table. If it were placed farther away, it would encompass more than the table. Therefore, the table converges to that portion of space after crossing 1 meter of space, but the portion occupied by the table is another quantum of space for much more extensive information. In other words, a portion of space the size of the table contains the maximum possible information about other objects placed at a certain distance from it, and therefore the portion of space occupied by the table is also the minimum capable of containing all the information about a larger object placed at a greater distance. This is what I mean when I speak of different quantum levels of space. It is possible to conceive of the organization of space at each of its smallest points as a cone. If this cone of infinite length is viewed in each of the circular planes that form it, these contain, toward the peak, more algorithmically organized information, that is, the 1 mm diameter portion capable of containing the table also contains, in the form of algorithmic code, the quantum of the quantum of the quantum of the table. Therefore, a convergent organization, in which each portion contains a greater concentrated inclusion of information, is part of the organization of space. The conical organization of space changes as a whole in the vicinity of a gravitational field. This is the same as saying that space curves in the presence of a gravitational field. The inclusive process in space changes when matter appears. In the latter, a restricted point contains no information about the whole, that is, A point in the table does not contain the algorithm of the entire table. In matter, every object acts as a minimum quantum of space. This is one difference between space and matter. In the former, everything is more complex, redundant, and contains more information. In matter, everything is less complex, redundant, and contains less information. See Chapter 12. We, who see points in space of a very restricted size, recreate in them images that are nothing other than reconstructions of the quanta of the quanta of the quanta. Or, if you prefer, ascending inclusion in informational quantity. Returning to the comparison between brain and space, current physiology considers that the brain is conscious as an emergent property resulting from its organization, complexity, number of interacting elements, and logical processes of inclusion and others. Space appears to be equally or more complex in its organization than the brain, to be organized in a similar way, and to possess a similar algorithmic logic. According to the conception of consciousness as emerging from sufficient complexity, space should be conscious, even more conscious than a brain, which ultimately is nothing more than a materialization of space. As you move up from account level to account level and analyze the information flow that occurs across the levels, an equation such as E equal to me, where E equal to energy, M equal to time, C equal to speed of light, takes on an extraordinary meaning. If E stands for space, not energy, then this is the equation for information flow through the space-matter continuum. The transformation of space into matter and of matter into space, as a function of the speed of light, is an accelerated function. It is the same idea, applied to the exponential increase in the surface area of the cone's circles, that makes this equation applicable, with the substitution of E equal to energy for E equal to space, to the consideration of the space-matter continuum. But to further clarify the meaning of the space-matter transformation, it is necessary to consider light, an extraordinary phenomenon. Light travels at the maximum speed permissible in our universe. Composed of massless, timeless particle waves, light would seem to be merely the manifestation of something pre-existing. Hence, the word travels is in quotation marks. In reality, nothing travels, least of all light. If space is conceived as a hypercomplex energy network, light would be a manifestation of such a pre-existing network. Several experiments support this view. For example, if the speed of light is measured relative to a moving reference point, its speed remains constant despite the movement of the reference point. This constancy of the speed of light is an extraordinary phenomenon, and only understandable if light is considered, as here, a manifestation of the pre-existing organization of space. Our worldview is the materialization of the organization of space, or rather, the expansion of each of its minimal quanta. We are therefore tentacles of God. If time is conceived as a change in the organization of space, the experiment that we will describe in Appendix A of this book is the result of the change of time in gel space, given by the diffusion of specific antibodies. If time is a change in the organization of space, it is possible to think that its emergence is related to processes of highly complex energy interaction. In particular, those associated with the mutual energy exchanges between different quanta of space. Let's take music as an example, which constitutes a manipulation of time. The composer manipulates the organization of space through sounds. These, when expanded, provoke a change in space, and thus create time. Rhythm, tonal sequences, basso continuo, allegretto, and pizzicato all create time. Of course, there is an interaction, first of space and the musical changes that expand within it. Then between all of this, and the brain, the sound creator, the listener. But time itself is not this interaction, but its production as an effect on the organization of space. A space in which time is circumscribed and forms an intrinsic dimensional part of itself is a four-dimensional space. I mean that the three spatial dimensions are complemented by the organization of space itself. This space, in which time is the organization, or better, the changes in the organization of space, is the space to which Ouspensky and Hinton referred. But space and time conceived in this way include all four dimensions in one. In reality, the organization of space is an algorithm capable of reconstructing all possible dimensions. Therefore, when I speak of time as a change in the organization of space, I am speaking of a fundamental change. However, there is not just one time, but as many as there are categories of organizational changes. Each energetic or structural morphology affects the organization of space in a specific way. This is the case with music, whose extraordinary variety can indicate the infinite number of possible times. Whether it is a word, a sound, a light, or an antibody and an antigen, energetic and structural morphologies expanding in space, and therefore affecting its organization, all of them create different times. In the appearance of two circular bands of antigens reacting with antibodies, there is the manifestation of a temporal change specific to each band. This is what has been called the different diffusion rate, see Appendix A. A gel is a space within a space. Therefore, the time that changes within the gel space is dimensionally different from the time created in extraterrestrial space, in the space of a planetary atmosphere, or in the space of a solid. In the latter, time almost doesn't exist, at least in non-radioactive solids. A mass of concrete is a space in which time almost doesn't pass. In contrast, a radioactive cobalt rod is a space that, by continually changing its organization, changes its time. Therefore, a non-radioactive solid persists, while a living organism ages. Time almost doesn't pass through the solid, instead, the organism creates it. It is at the space-matter interface where time is created. Of course, the almost we use deserves an explanation. There are atomic motions, cosmic ray embedding, gravitational and magnetic effects on a non-radioactive solid. All of this represents a change in the organization of the solid space. Compared to a solid transparent space is more synergistic, see Chapter 12, since it possesses the capacity to transform dimensionally. It is like the most fundamental element of the universe. It is always found behind any manifestation, since every manifestation can be reduced to the particular organization of each space. Thus, time as a change in the organization of space is always a dimensional change of organization. This is where life enters. More dimensional changes occur in it than in any other space. Even an exploding star, shifting between solid, liquid, gaseous and spatial dimensions, is a less efficient creator of time than the organism of a mosquito. Thousands of chemical changes occur in the body of this insect, dimensional changes in the strictest sense of the word. In the human organism, maximum satisfaction is achieved in the variety and characteristics of the dimensional changes that occur within its space. The brain is capable of transforming itself into space and creating experience and consciousness. Thus, from the most elementary dimensional transformation in the space of a cell, to the fantastic expansion of neural fields in space, this is the range of human dimensional changes. A multitude of different times coexist within each of us. Aging is merely an imbalance between our different times. Anti-entropy is a tendency toward increasing homogeneity, driven by a more extensive and advanced heterogeneity. This seemingly contradictory state of affairs is not. Suppose that in a cubic meter of concrete, we find a few zones where a gestalt dimensional change occurs. A small piece of debris altering a small zone within the concrete cube by a millionth of a degree Celsius would create a dimensional change in the spatial organization of the concrete, and, relative to other zones of the same, a heterogeneous space. Time will be created in the zones of the concrete block that change organization. In homogeneous, unchanged zones, time will pass slowly. The synergy of space and that of a living organism are qualitatively different, and therefore create different manifestations. Life, experience, and consciousness are some of them. Ultimately, they are different approaches to the same time. See Chapter 13. Therefore, wisdom is the understanding of time. Global time, see Chapter 3, is altered by fire, which accelerates it, or by cold, which slows it down. An increase in temperature is a specific change in the organization of space that is transformed into heat and cold by us. Perhaps different magnitudes of the same time, or perhaps different times, are the basis of heat and cold. That's why a freezer keeps food in good condition. It slows down overall time. Matter is the simultaneous perception of millions of portions of space. Transparency is the inability to simultaneously perceive portions of space. It is an organization so complex that its decoding G is IMPOS Sybil. TH at is T-ra NSPA re N psi MEAN STHE inability to perceive THE co MMONWH only. 3 on time management. The conical arrangement of the organization of information contained in space not only explains the flow of information through it and the convergence of information from quantum to quantum of space, but also explains ourselves. We are the ultimate points of convergence, since we are capable of perceiving greater numbers of quantum of space than any other entity. The concentration of information that fills us is many orders of magnitude greater than any quantum of space, since we are capable of containing them all. The same is true of time. The life of a cell lasts several days, that of an insect, several weeks, that of a rat, several years, and that of a human, several decades. The life of a star lasts several million years, and that of a galaxy, several billion. A day for a human is a year for a mosquito, and a decade for a cell. If the unit of time is the emergence, maturation, and death of any process, there are as many times as there are sequences of births and deaths. A chemical reaction is one time, an elementary particle, another time. The activation of a receptor, the emergence of an action potential, the growth and death of a cell in our body, or a thought in our brain, all form different times. We humans are the entire set of times that inhabit us. We are the time of all our times. Global time is our life, and is glimpsed with pristine clarity at the moment of death. While we live, global time passes at a speed that makes it impossible to perceive any of the other times. We cannot recognize the activation of our receptors or the transmission of nerve signals through our nerves. Our global time, as a set of all times, can only see itself, and not these. Only when global time is transformed does access to other times become possible. Techniques such as present expansion or time shortening are excellent for accessing processes that occur faster than global time. See Chapter 9. Time management is precisely the transformation of one time into another. To understand more clearly what the existence of a global time means, it is necessary to analyze the emergence of conscious experience in time. Let's imagine an entire brain with its connections to sensory organs intact. Let's suppose that this brain has remained unconscious, and that at an instant X, it begins to function. Let's call this instant X times 0. At time 0, the the sensory organs connected to the rest of the brain begin to transform signals, what we call light, sound, temperature, pressure, etc., into neuronal activity. This activity penetrates the brain and in a span of approximately 50 milliseconds is transformed into perceptual experience. Everything that happens in those 50 milliseconds will become a unitary experience. In other words, the time necessary to have a perceptual experience is measured with a clock, finite. But in terms of the experience itself, it is infinitesimal. Everything that happens in 50 milliseconds represents for consciousness a timeless present instant. Everything that happens in 50 milliseconds is included in a timeless experience, the present. Global time is the present experience resulting from the phenomenological reduction of a finite time to zero time. Global time experienced as non-time includes all the times of each and every neuronal and cellular reaction that, in and of itself, occurs in other times. All synaptic and axonal potentials, all chemical reactions, all atomic and nuclear changes that occur in thousandths or millionths of a second multiplied by 50 milliseconds give rise to an experience felt as timeless, and that necessarily includes them. Global time then contains millions of times united in a unitary experience. The latter, in physical terms, is the synergistic emergent property of all the elemental changes that comprise it. There are at least two possible ways to explain such a synergistic and emergent property, which I can only point out for now and which I will analyze later. The first is what I have called the neuronal field. All energetic activations that occur as a result of neuronal and cellular activity, in general, create a resulting energetic field in space that, in itself, is distinct from the elemental activation that constructs it. Thus, all action potentials, all synaptic potentials, all electrotonic and glial conductions contribute to the creation of an energetic whole that is in itself unitary and synergistic. For this field to be conscious, it must reach a necessary complexity, and this is only achieved when everything that happens in the span of approximately 50 milliseconds ms is taken into account. Part of this necessary complexity is the second physical correlate of experience. I refer to the activation of convergent circuits, which, in 50 milliseconds, manage to transform the dispersed neuronal activity into a hypercomplex inclusive code or pattern that algorithmically contains all the dispersed patterns. Time management is nothing more than the transformation and creation of new or different hierarchical levels of convergence. These transformations are the basis of what I have called the expansion of the present and constitute the way in which time management appears before consciousness. A more extensive discussion of the above is included in Chapter 9, 4 on time and the organization of space. Time is a change in the organization of space. The existence of a minimum quantum of space guarantees the existence of time. This is so because a minimum quantum of space implies the existence of a quantum of space inclusive of another quantum, which implies a change in the informational organization. The conical informational organization of space is nothing more than a change in it, and therefore whenever we speak of such an organization, the occurrence of time is implied. Of course, the term time in its phenomenological and experiential nature is, in essence, far removed from its physical nature. Furthermore, what we experience as time is something much more complicated than what physics conceptualizes as a change in the organization of space. This is so because the time we live in is a hyper-complex global time. The sum of all times, on the other hand, time, from a physical point of view, is the critical element or the basis of any elementary time. The experimental evidence supporting the conceptualization of time as a change in the organization of space consists of the temporal flow changes associated with different gravitational field strengths. These tests, which I have already mentioned, consisted of measuring the temporal flow near and far from the Earth's gravitational field. Near the Earth, a high-intensity gravitational field, time flows more rapidly than far from it, a relatively low-intensity gravitational field. The idea of time as the fourth dimension of space is the consideration of organization as a dimension independent of our other three dimensions of space. Of course, is considered independent in a relative sense, since three-dimensionality of space is nothing more than the organization of space. Here again, the phenomenological view is less widespread than the physical view. In the latter, special importance is given to what is found as the unifying basis of what is experienced as differentiated. Thus, the concept of the organization of space differs from the view of space as consisting of three or more dimensions, just as the concept of an elementary particle differs from the products of its complex interactions, the chemical elements. Although a gravitational change results in a change in the flow of time, gravitation itself is only one of many possible ways in which changes in the organization of space manifest themselves. However, it is interesting to analyze time as a result of gravitational fields, as this allows us to conceptualize time within the space-matter continuum. If a gravitational force increases in intensity in the vicinity of a material body, and if this also increases the speed of the flow of time, this latter increase must be considered for its understanding in light of the particular organization of space that we call matter. We will see in Chapter 12 how a material object, from the perspective of informational organization, is a decrease in synergy between different quanta of space minima. The approach of an observer to a material body is the intersection of the former with a decreasing spatial synergy. If time flows more rapidly near a material body, and if the latter represents a decrease in synergy in spatial organization, then the organizational change determining an increase in temporal flow is precisely the synergistic flow of the space-matter continuum. We'll delve deeper into the concept of synergy in Chapter 12. For now, it's enough to recall that three properties of space define it. First, the size of each minimum quantum of space. Second, quantum redundancy. And third, the amount of informational content in each quantum. There will be greater synergy as long as there is greater quantum redundancy, fewer dimensions and greater informational content in each quantum. The amount of informational content is the closest measure of synergy. If a space contains less quantum redundancy, greater dimensions in each, and less informational content, its synergy will be less and very close to that of matter. In a space in which each minimal quantum differs from the rest, time does not flow in any direction. In a space of high synergy in which each quantum is identical to the rest, time does not exist. It is in the global synergistic organizational transition that we can speak of temporal flow, and the existence of time. It is interesting to meditate on fire in this context. When I speak of global organizational transition, I refer to any algorithmic series capable of mathematically representing space with different degrees of synergy. An algorithmic series is the inclusive conic organization of space itself. It is important to emphasize that by algorithm, I mean a measure of organization. In other words, if we consider a set of minimal quanta of space and analyze them globally, it is possible to algorithmize their organization as long as the set of quanta gives rise to a global pattern. The less synergistic the place in space to be algorithmized, the easier it will be to obtain its algorithm. An algorithmic series for space is, then, a mathematical description of a synergistic organizational continuum. On the other hand, the notion that global time is phenomenological time, and that the latter is extremely variable, should already be clear. This is explained by the fact that, since global time is constituted by all elementary times, any variation in the latter determines an alteration in the former. To say that global time is phenomenological time is equivalent to considering what results from the total functioning of the organism as a whole. The global result is consciousness, while the experience of global time is the emergent property resulting from the interactions between the times of each cell, molecule, neuronal circuit, etc., that make us up. Global time is to elemental times, as the total organism is to the cells that comprise it. The analysis of time as a change in the organization of space also applies to perception. Each material object is a different organization of the space-matter continuum, and therefore a different time. What we perceive are the different Sintergic times included in the space-matter continuum. We perceive as many times as we possess elementary times. In other words, the range of our perceptions is the range over which our global time extends, a time in the space-matter continuum that exceeds the limits of our global time will not be perceived. The transparency of space is explained, on the one hand, by the great synergy of the minimal quanta that comprise it, so much so that our perceptual systems are incapable of extracting an organization from such a synergy, and therefore do not see space as materialized, but as transparent. And on the other hand, by the fact that time, in transparent space, exceeds, in some way, the range of elementary times that form global time. Time is a non-specific sensation in transparent space, and it is light in the material world. Time management, as it relates to an expansion in the duration of the present, is nothing more than an expansion in the range of global time. This increase in range allows us to perceive times in the space-matter continuum, read objects that normally exceed our perceptual capacity. Therefore, an expansion of the present would allow us to perceive a galactic body as a luminous materialization, and not as a set of isolated luminous points. Expanding the range of global time undoubtedly expands consciousness into regions that are normally inaccessible. Consciousness is, in its foundations, the greatest mystery; in its actions, the most incredible wonder. The action of transforming the times that surround us into experiences is its destiny. Regarding the relationship between time and brain function, it is possible to postulate that there is a minimum time in which the spatial organization contained within a minimum quantum of the same is capable of normally activating the retina. If this minimum is exceeded, the resulting sensation is static. If, on the other hand, this minimum is less, the resulting perception is a lack of detail. A clear case in which this occurs is blurred vision associated with an excessively high translation speed. What happens in this case is that not one, but a series of minimum spatial quanta transect the retina in the minimum time. The possibility of spatial decoding is exceeded, and the result is blurred vision. An example of this is traveling in an airplane or a car. Objects close to the object are blurred, while distant objects are clearly perceived, albeit in relative motion. The minimum quanta for near objects are less redundant than for distant objects, therefore the latter, regardless of speed, produce clear vision, while the former do not. The minimal quanta for distant objects contain the same or very similar information in tiny portions of space, and therefore traveling through them at high speed does not affect their perception. The quanta for nearby objects change from portion to portion of space, and therefore, traveling through them at high speed is equivalent to presentation below the minimum time necessary for adequate decoding. Again, this example clearly demonstrates the convergent informational organization of space. I already mentioned that this organization is entirely similar to that of the brain. With respect to convergent inclusive coding circuits, we will see this in greater detail later and in Appendix B of this work. Suffice it to say here that the similarities between space and the brain are extraordinary, as is the brain's ability to decode the former. Again, the example of a car trip is illustrative. As we travel, we sequentially and continuously transect billions of minimal quanta of space. If the decoding of a single quantum is an incredible feat, the sequence decoding of millions of them exceeds any attempt at explanation. The perceptual continuity resulting from a sequenced interaction with different quanta of space implies some mechanism for fluidly joining percepts into a continuous whole. The sense of time associated with sequential transecting is the creation of changes in spatial organization at the most complex level conceivable. Such decoding of quantum sequences is, at our current evolutionary level, an automated activity, although it surely was not at one time. All this speaks to our wonder as creators. 5 neural fields and space, in Foundations of Experience and New Principles of Physiological Psychology, I analyzed the emergent nature of experience as a result of the creation of neural fields. This relationship will be expanded upon in subsequent chapters. Before doing so, I would like to analyze the relationships between neural fields and space, since only this analysis will clarify the emergence of the subjective. We have already mentioned that any event that interacts with space alters its organization. This is clear with regard to material objects, whether immobile or in translation, within the energetic organization of space. It is also clear with regard to purely energetic phenomena not perceived as materializations that travel through space. One of these energetic phenomena is what I have called the neuronal field, which arises as a product of the three-dimensional interactions between the electrochemical activation of the billions of neurons that make up the brain tissue of humans and other animals. When a neuron is activated, it establishes energetic communication with the neurons surrounding it. This communication takes place through extra and interaxial channels. Communication of the first type is through the extracellular medium, and the second through both intercellular and intracellular media simultaneously. In a time no greater than the duration of the present plus 50 MSEC, the activation of neuronal elements and their mutual interactions form an energy field of interactions, hypercomplex in character and global in dimensionality. This hypercomplex energy field is the neuronal field. There is an expansion of the neuronal field in space, thereby creating alterations in its informational energy organization. Each minimal quantum of space contains, among other things, information related to the neural fields that travel through it. It is no exaggeration to say that this explains the instances of direct communication misnamed extrasensory. Furthermore, the interaction between neural fields and the organization of space is the basis for the emergence of experience. See the following chapters. Not only brain tissue is capable of creating energy fields. In reality, every organ in the body, as a living organization, is associated with an energy field. Shamanic containment, according to which man is a luminous being, refers to the creation of energy fields resulting from organic and cellular activity. Both the morphology and the arrangement of the different organs that comprise us participate in the development of field characteristics that have been barely studied until now. The same can be said of the body surface as a possible modulator of the field, including the arrangement of wrinkles and fingerprints across the entire surface of the skin. Since what we see are energetic organizations arranged in such a way that they appear to us as objects, and what we do not perceive are also energetic organizations too synergistic to be materialized. It is conceivable that not only a living organism develops energy fields, but inanimate objects do so as well. Furthermore, any graphic design drawn on a two-dimensional surface affects the organization of space, since it can be perceived from great distances. It is safe to say that certain lines must provoke peculiar energetic effects. Religious and mystical symbolism must be based on this. Regarding the neuronal field, it is worth mentioning WRAD's analysis of brain tissue activity in terms of the three compartments that comprise it, namely, the neuronal environment itself, axons, dendrites and cell bodies, the glial environment, and the extracellular environment. Each neuron is surrounded by a population of glial cells that far exceeds the number of neurons in the brain. Glia are not only a means of structural support and a participant in neuronal nutrition, but, as Haydn has shown, they also participate in complex processes such as learning. Adi has detected impedance changes, recorded through electrodes placed in brain tissue, that cannot be explained based on neuronal activity alone. Glia appear to intervene in the brain's electrical activity, probably through the modulation of signals arising from dendritic or axonal activation. The extracellular medium or compartment is, even more than the neuroglial tissue, the neuronal atmosphere. All neuronal tissue is immersed in a soup of mucopolysaccharides formed by nitrogenous molecules and sugar derivatives. This medium forms a kind of paste between each of the neurons and glial cells. Adi himself has detected changes in impedance due to alterations in the extracellular medium. It is no exaggeration to say that the entire series of neuronal electrochemical activations transect the extracellular medium and are somehow affected by it. The neuronal field, as the global result of all energetic interactions between cellular elements of brain tissue, depends, in its morphology and general characteristics, on the functional interplay between the three aforementioned brain compartments. But as I mentioned before, not only is the creation of a neuronal field conceivable, but also the creation of energy fields resulting from cellular activity in each and every tissue and organ of the body. We could call these fields global, including the neuronal field. Global fields, then, are energetic alterations capable of crossing the dermal barrier and extending into space. There is certainly evidence of this. One of them is the so-called Kirlian aura, recorded by electrophotography. So-called auras are another example of organic energetic alterations expanding into space. What we must ask in this chapter is about the effects that such expansion has on the structure and informational organization of space. Let's begin with some crude effects supported by the Metaphysical Research Group in Sussex, England. The instrument this group uses to investigate the effect of mental activity on space is a horizontal pendulum called the Cameron instrument, named after Reverend Vern L. Cameron, its inventor. The instrument is a precision wire terminated in a pointing weight at one end and coupled with a power spring and a handle. According to the metaphysical group, a trained experimenter can detect minute vibrations of the pendulum associated with subtle energy changes. In one of their experiments, a group of observers directed their attention to objects in a room, while the pendulum operator closely followed the vibrations. In all cases, the operator was able to point to the objects the observers were thinking about without error. This means that brain activity is capable of affecting space in a definite and specific way. In another experiment, several observers were tasked with visualizing a cube using internal images. The observer not only indicated its position, but was also able to outline its shape. This experiment indicates that neural fields are capable of organizing space into concrete three-dimensional forms. Other experiments, such as touching an object in a room and then allowing the operator to find it, or choosing a book from among many with the resulting specific oscillation of the pendulum, demonstrate to the operator beyond any doubt that a spatially expanding energy field is created by the brain and the entire organism. Another set of evidence is the effect of cognitive activity on the magnitude, brightness, and movement of flames. In these experiments, which any reader can repeat, a subject observes a candle flame until a relationship is found between its movements and their cognitive or emotional state. They can then control the flame, remaining in a specific psychological state. Without a doubt, there is a direct brain-to-brain transmission of emotions. Qualitative observations made by me leave me with no doubt about this. The most well-known effects are the alteration in the chemical composition of metals through focused attention and intention. The well-known psychic Uri Geller has achieved these effects in front of various audiences. Children who have observed his demonstrations have been able to replicate his results. Finally, every expert in the Wan Qing knows that there is a relationship between the fall of coins and the hexagram to be obtained. If a person repeatedly tosses 3 coins, they will soon notice a correspondence between their fall head or tail and their internal states. Once this relationship is detected, it is possible to voluntarily control the fall. All that is required is to maintain the appropriate internal state. Tests conducted by me on myself and 2 other subjects indicate that the coin drop can be controlled without error. These observations yielded a probability of occurrence, by chance, of less than 0.0001. Again, these experiments require no equipment and can be replicated by anyone. All of the above is evidence of changes in the organization of the space-matter continuum, resulting from the expansion of energy fields in space. They indicate that these fields affect space in specific and spectacularly concrete ways. Nothing can be said at this time about the fine details of such interactions between neural fields and space. A whole series of key experiments must be devised to clarify and study the details of these effects. Suffice it to say that it is conceivable that the neural field could affect time and gravitational force, effect the materialization and dematerialization of objects, and allow for extraordinary practical applications such as levitation, the manipulation of physical objects at a distance, etc.